face value, the message of our Gospel reading for this Sunday is that we ought to seek to recognize Christ in our brothers and sisters, and especially in those who are doing the work of the Lord, and in treating them accordingly, we will be rewarded. And I'm not sure if there is much more that we can glean or get out of our Gospel reading. So I have instead opted to focus on the Old Testament reading for this Sunday, which is Genesis 22, 1 to 14, the very well-known story of the almost sacrifice of Isaac. For some people, the story may sit uncomfortably, and this, I think, is for at least two reasons. The first and most obvious is that it strikes us perhaps as unreasonable, maybe even cruel, maybe even sadistic, that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his son, especially given that previously Abraham and Sarah had been barren, and that Isaac was the product of a miraculous promise issued by God which had materialized. God had told Abraham that Isaac would be the father of many nations, that through Isaac, Abraham's offspring would become as numerous as the stars in the night sky and as the grains of sand on the seashore. So in light of this, it seems not only cruel but nonsensical that God would ask Abraham to sacrifice his one and only son, for which him and Sarah had waited so long. The second reason as to why the story perhaps does not sit well with us is that seemingly the phenomenon of child sacrifice, which to us is utterly barbaric, hence why the story does not sit well, was a feature of the larger Canaanite society in which ancient Judaism was situated. And there is apparently debate amongst scholars as to the nature and extent of this type of sacrifice, and whether or not it was a feature of nascent Hebrew culture. It has been long held, or it was long held, that child sacrifice was associated with a Canaanite god called Moloch or Molech. More recently, it has emerged that the root word for this name, Moloch or Molech, itself means sacrifice, and that it therefore referred not to a deity, but to the practice itself of sacrifice or of child sacrifice. With this backdrop then, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is said to reflect a throwback to or a hang-up about such practices within the Old Testament context. But the story can be read and interpreted in various ways. It can be read as a parable or a fable or a moralizing story. The signature line in response to Isaac's seemingly tragic question, "Where is the lamb, Father, for the burnt offering?" which is that God himself will provide the lamb, is seen as one among many of prophetic references to Christ contained within the Old Testament. And while this may appear to be a neat-fitting and satisfying explanation, I believe it also points to an observation regarding the system of gradated sacrifice, which was largely man-made, and the larger context of Torah in which this appeared. And Paul, I think, uncovers this in his writings, and in particular in his letter to the Romans. Paul writes, "Apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the very commandment that promised life proved to be death to me. For sin, seizing an opportunity in the commandment, deceived me, and through it killed me." And this is from Romans chapter 7, verse 8b to 11. Now, the central mystery regarding the law, that is the Jewish Torah, is that on the one hand, we cannot dispute, or it's very difficult to dispute, the notion that Torah, in its essence, was given or issued by God. And this is reflected or represented in the story of the stone tablets which Moses receives on Mount Sinai. We also cannot dispute the fact that at its core, the law represents certain immutable and universal principles and values which provide God's creation, and in particular the human race, with a sense of order and rectitude. However, on the other hand, there lies within the law a trap, and the trap is twofold. Firstly, and most immediately, the law tempts us towards self-righteousness and the inflation of our egos. Because if we believe that we are law-abiding, that we can keep the law, we fall into the trap of thinking that we are righteous people. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, and this is what is represented, I think, in the connection between the almost sacrifice of Isaac and the atoning death of Christ, and I think it's also the point that Paul is making in certain parts of Romans, namely that the ultimate end of the law, regardless of which way we look at it or regardless of how we approach it, is death. And this is where I think the human factor comes in terms of the construction of the system of the law and of gradated sacrifice. The system which we created, which we can think of abstractly in terms of the Judeo-Christian tradition as the law, is a voracious system whose appetite can never be sated and whose thirst can never be slaked. No matter how many animals, no matter how many bulls, no matter how many sheep and goats were sacrificed, the law always reverted to the same inevitable conclusion regarding human nature, namely one of condemnation, and this in a state of unrighteousness. And so what is the human response to this? It is to exact tighter laws, to demand the sacrifice of more animals, to offer more blood, to appease this insatiable system which had somehow become predicated on a futile pursuit for righteousness and affirmation in human terms and in human eyes. And this is precisely why, within first century Judaism, the gospel, and Paul's message in particular, was so radical, even scandalous. What this proposed was revolutionary, a system predicated not on human righteousness, but on the grace of God. And so I close with a verse from the Romans reading, which is set for this Sunday. Sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. Romans chapter 6, verse 14. As you continue to contemplate these things, may God's hand of guidance, protection, and blessing remain upon you and those you love. Amen.